welcome to The Explainer. So, have you ever wondered how the modern Indian state actually took its shape right out of the ashes of an ancient empire? Today, we are diving deep into the staggering economic and administrative transformation of India under British rule. We're going to look at the hard data, the intense historical debates, and the sweeping reforms to really understand how an entire subcontinent was fundamentally rewired over just a couple of centuries.
Let's start with a massive, mind-boggling economic mystery. How exactly did India's share of world industrial output plummet from a massive 25% in 1750 all the way down to a mere 2% by 1900? I mean, that is an absolutely astronomical collapse for an economy that was once a global powerhouse. To understand how such a dramatic shift occurred, we really need to break down the timeline and the actual mechanics of this decline. To objectively unpack this historical puzzle, here's our roadmap. We'll start with the Great Economic Collapse, then look at the two shocks of deindustrialization, explore engineering the extraction, witness the rewiring of the state, and finally, we'll wrap up with education and the law.
All right, Section 1, the Great Economic Collapse. Let's look at the sheer scale of India's deindustrialization.
On one side of the historical debate, we have the powerful nationalist perspective. Famously championed by voices like Shashi Tharoor, the argument here is straightforward and honestly very compelling. The British actively looted and destroyed indigenous Indian industry. From this perspective, the colonial regime deliberately dismantled local manufacturing, especially textiles, through unfair tariffs and oppressive policies designed entirely to serve the British Crown, basically turning a prosperous nation into an impoverished colonial subject.
Section 2, two shocks of deindustrialization.
When we zoom out and look at the macroeconomic data, specifically research from the National Bureau of Economic Research, we see a highly complex picture. The data reveals this wasn't just a single event, but two compounding forces. First, an internal domestic crisis, the decline of the Mughal Empire, which acted as a massive supply-side shock. Second, a global crisis, a globalization shock, which acted as a devastating price-side shock. These two forces didn't just happen in isolation, they essentially compounded on each other to unravel India's industrial dominance. So let's trace the domino effect of that first internal shock.
It created a fascinating kind of counterintuitive chain reaction. As the central authority of the Mughal Empire crumbled in the 18th century, regional instability skyrocketed. Because of this chaos, rapacious revenue farmers squeezed the peasants, massively increasing rent burdens. Naturally, this caused agricultural productivity to drop sharply. Now here is the absolutely crucial economic pivot. Because less food was being grown, grain prices shot up. Since workers lived near subsistence, their nominal wages had to rise just so they could afford to eat. And finally, because wages went up, the cost to produce Indian cotton textiles surged. So incredibly, long before British steam-powered factories even arrived, India was actually already pricing itself out of the world export market.
Then came that external shock. Back in 1750, India was at its absolute peak. But by 1810, driven by those internal wage hikes we just talked about, India lost its grip on the world export market. A critical turning point, right? But the absolute final blow comes between 1810 and 1860. The world experienced a transport revolution, trade barriers fell, and Britain's new, highly efficient factory-made textiles completely flooded the local Indian domestic market. The relative price of manufactured goods crashed globally. Indian handloom weavers simply could not compete with the sheer volume and low cost of British factory yarn and cloth.
Okay, moving to Section 3, engineering the extraction.
So, the huge question here is, how did the British extract wealth from this newly deindustrialized, heavily agricultural landscape? Well, they built a massive extraction engine through three distinct land tax policies. In the East, they set up the permanent Zamindari system, empowering landlords to collect taxes. In the north and central areas, they used the Mahalwari system, taxing entire village communities. And down in the south, they used the Ryotwari system, taxing the individual farmers directly. While the methods varied, the ultimate result was the same everywhere. Land became a highly commercialized commodity, and agriculture was completely reorganized to produce cash crops for factories back in England.
The human cost of these complex tax policies was just devastating. As British colonial administrator Charles Metcalfe hauntingly put it, the Indian farmers were born in debt, lived in debt, and died in debt. Because the British fixed the tax rates incredibly high, we're talking often at 50% of the produce, farmers were driven into inescapable debt the second a crop failed. They had to borrow from ruthless moneylenders and eventually were forced to surrender their newly commercialized lands. It created the sweeping cycle of poverty and birthed the brand new class of landless agricultural laborers.
Section 4. Rewiring the state.
See, the British didn't just disrupt the economy. They had to build an entirely new system to manage their wealth and maintain absolute order. To control such a sprawling, fractured subcontinent, they passed a rapid succession of constitutional acts. In 1773, the Regulating Act began centralizing power to curb wild corruption by company officials. Then the Pitt's India Act in 1784 asserted the British Parliament's ultimate control. The 1833 Charter Act ended the East India Company's trade monopolies entirely, officially making it a governing body. And finally, after the Rebellion of 1857, direct rule was transferred from the company straight to the British Crown. Step by step, they legally bound the subcontinent into a single political entity.
To actually enforce these new laws, they imposed a brand new administrative order, laying foundations you can honestly still see today. They instituted a fiercely competitive civil service. They formalized a dual judicial system of civil and criminal courts. They established a highly structured police system to maintain internal order. And of course, they maintained a massive military system to defend their supremacy. It was a vast, incredibly efficient machine of governance.
Which brings us to Section 5, Education and the Law.
Here was the big logistical problem. To run this massive bureaucracy, the British needed local administrators. They simply couldn't import enough clerks from England. Lord Macaulay's 1835 education policy made their goals explicitly clear. It wasn't just about reading, it was literally social engineering. They aimed to create a specific middle class of administrators who looked Indian, but thought, acted, and governed like the British, using English as the primary medium of instruction.
But, history is full of profound ironies. This English education system acted as a complete double-edged sword. Yes, it produced the clerks the empire needed, but it paradoxically exposed a whole generation of Indians to Western democratic ideals. Think Mill, Rousseau, and Montesquieu. It fostered secularism, sparked critical journalism, and ignited massive social reformations. So, ultimately, the very education system designed to subjugate and manage the population ended up providing the intellectual ammunition for the nationalist movements that would eventually rise up and challenge British rule.
You've seen the staggering economic collapse and the devastating human cost of those land taxes. But we've also seen the undeniable construction of a unified, modern, legal and administrative framework. So we leave you with this question to ponder. Did the imposition of a modern legal and administrative state offset the century of economic deindustrialization? It is an incredibly complex reality of colonial history that absolutely still shapes our world today. Keep questioning the history, and thanks for joining us on this explainer.